Everyone talks about summer like it's supposed to be carefree. But if this season brings up money stress, body stress, family stress, or social stress, that's real too. Growth therapy can help with that. Whether it's your first time in therapy or your 50th, Grow makes it easier to find a therapist who fits you, not the other way around. They connect you with thousands of independent licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person visits, nights and weekends. You can search by what matters, like insurance, specialty, identity, or availability, and get started in as little as 2 days. And if something comes up, you can cancel up to 24 hours in advance at no cost. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Grow helps you find therapy on your time. Whatever challenges you're facing, Grow Therapy is here to help. Grow accepts over 100 insurance plans, including Medicaid in some states. Sessions average about $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0 depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/booknow to get started. That's growtherapy.com/booknow. growtherapy.com/booknow. Availability and coverage by state and insurance plan.
This is the Station for Negotiation podcast episode number 61. My name is Gene Killian. I've been a lawyer and professional negotiator for 40 years. Sometimes in a negotiation, you can't give an inch. Sometimes in a negotiation, you can't even concede that there's a negotiation going on. Now, that may sound strange coming from someone like me because on this podcast, we often talk about building bridges, using empathy, showing respect to the other side. But there are instances where you just can't do that. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. Maybe you're dealing with an opponent who has crossed an ethical or moral line. Maybe you're dealing with an opponent who has breached the duty of good faith to you in various ways. There could be a number of reasons for doing that, for drawing a line in the sand and refusing to move. And we're going to explore an extreme one today. I'm going to draw today for the episode on a book that came out last year, 2025, as I'm recording this, called Victory 45, The End of the War in 8 Surrenders by James Holland, a great historian, and Al Murray. This is a really good book, and I was excited to find it in the bookstore because when it said the end of the war in 8 surrenders, I figured, wow, 8 surrenders means there's 8 negotiations in this book. I can't wait to read it. That's what a negotiation nerd I am. But I want to talk about a specific negotiation that took place toward the end of the Second World War, or at the end of the Second World War, and I think there are really valuable lessons that we can learn from studying this negotiation. And to do that, we're going to go back to May 3rd, 1945. And it's raining. And it's raining at a place called the Lüneburg Heath, which is a field in southern Germany. And on this field, there are 5 German officers in long greatcoats standing at attention. And they're in the open air, and they're on a low rise called the Temeloberg, under a British flag that's snapping on a flagpole. And they've been kept waiting there for a while on purpose. One of them is an admiral. His name is Hans Georg von Friedeberg, and he's the new commander-in-chief of the German Navy. He's been sent to this negotiation by Karl Dönitz, who has been Germany's head of state for exactly 72 hours. Another of the Germans is a 6'5" Prussian general by the name of Eberhard Kinzel. And this guy looks like he walked right out of central casting. He's ramrod straight, and he's got a monocle. If you called central casting and asked for a Prussian general, this is the guy they would send. But the amazing thing at this point is that the Germans are not in their mind a beaten delegation, which is incredible because they are at this point of the war caught in a pincer between the Red Army advancing on them in the east and the Western Allies, the Americans, the British, and the French advancing on them in the west. these Germans, these Nazi military people, think they've come to make a deal. And eventually a door opens on a caravan parked nearby, and out steps a small, slightly built man in a black beret, and he's wearing a pair of corduroy trousers that have been washed so many times they're almost white. And he looks at the delegation. And at this point, I want to pick up from the book, Victory 45, to set the stage. And here's what Holland and Murray write. None of the Germans spoke English, a small problem they had all overlooked. Montgomery and his men wore battle dress, soldiers' standard khaki wool two-piece, with Monty still sporting his famous two-badged beret. By contrast, von Friedeberg and his party wore leather greatcoats and the peaked caps of their respective services, looking every inch the German officer class. The Germans were serving up cliches, even at the end. Perhaps with some measure of barely concealed glee, Monty asserted himself immediately and made them wait, sauntering down the 5 steps of his caravan as they stood to attention saluting, and then returning their salute perfunctorily. The German delegation stood behind the line Monty had asked his staff to draw in the ground for them to tow. German accounts refer to a stick instead, and that Feldmarschall Busch never got over the insult shown towards the delegation and his staff by Monty. Now think about this for a minute. He literally draws a line and says, I'm not going to talk to you unless you all step up to this line and put your toes on it. So right from the beginning of this negotiation, and again, this is Gene speaking, not the book, he is framing the negotiation. He is making it clear this is not a negotiation between equals, and actually, I'm not here to negotiate at all. Back to the book. Who are you? Montgomery barked. I am General Admiral von Friedeberg, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, sir. I never heard of you. Who are you? General Kinzel. I never heard of you either. He turned to Friedel. Who are you? Friedel responded, You're a major? How dare you bring a major to my headquarters? He made very little effort to disguise how much he was enjoying being imperious in victory to his staff and to the reporters watching. So that's how this negotiation sets up. So as we go through this story, I want to give some context. Why did the Germans think they might have a deal with Montgomery? And to understand what's happening on the Temelloberg during this discussion, to understand whether this was a negotiation at all, you have to understand what was going on in Karl Dernitz's head. Hitler, mercifully, had shot himself on April 30th. And he appointed Karl Dernitz as his successor as the leader of Nazi Germany. And that was a surprise to a lot of people. So Dernitz set up shop in a place called Flensburg, which was near the Danish border, with the remains of what was left of the Nazi high command and government. And as I said, they were caught in a pincer between the Red Army and the Western Allies and didn't have much to negotiate with. Now, Dernitz was many things, and most of them were bad. But he was not delusional in the way that Hitler was delusional. He didn't think there was going to be some sort of magical reversal, last-minute reversal of the war, and that the Nazis were somehow going to win it. He's a realist. He looks at the map and he sees 2 things very clearly. The first thing he sees is what's happening on the Eastern Front to German soldiers and German civilians. The Red Army is rolling west, as I said, and there were, by some German estimates at the time, nearly 3 million German army soldiers, Wehrmacht soldiers, in the Eastern Theater, plus there were millions of civilian refugees trying to flee to the west. And Dernitz believed that if these soldiers and these civilians ended up in Soviet hands, a lot of them were going to die. given the extremely bitter war between the Germans and Soviets that took place on the Eastern Front. And he thought that a lot of them were just going to be sent to labor camps in Siberia. And the second thing he sees is there might be an opportunity here to drive a wedge between the West and the Soviets. Right to the end, the Nazis had good intelligence. And Dönitz knew that there had been tensions between London and Washington on one side and Moscow on the other. And he knew that Churchill had been talking in private that after the war, the West was going to have trouble with the Soviet Union. And so Dönitz formulates a strategy which is based on trying to drive a wedge between the Soviets and the Western allies. And the strategy is this: we're going to try to surrender piece by piece to the West. We are not going to surrender to the Soviets. So let's buy time. And every day, every hour that German forces in the East keep fighting, that's another day that German soldiers and refugees can move westward and surrender to the British and the Americans, where they will be treated under the Geneva Convention instead of being sent to Siberia to die. And maybe, just maybe, if we drag this out long enough, we can exploit cracks in the Allied coalition. So Dönitz sends von Friedeberg to Montgomery with a specific proposal, and the proposal is not, hey guys, we surrender. The proposal is this: we want to surrender, but we want to surrender to you, Field Marshal Montgomery. And we don't only want to surrender the forces that we have here fighting you, but we want to take the forces that are fighting the Soviets in the East and surrender those to you. And they have a letter from one of the German high officials, Field Marshal Keitel, offering up a major German army group, the Army Group Vistula, an army that wasn't fighting Montgomery at all, as I said. It was fighting Marshal Zhukov and the Soviets north of Berlin. Now think about this as a negotiation move. What the Germans know is that Montgomery has a huge ego, and he would like nothing better than to be the guy who takes the surrender of the entirety of Nazi Germany and to be memorialized through history as the great hero at the surrender. The Germans know that, and they're offering Montgomery a prize. 1 million+ German soldiers just handed over to British custody, removed from the Eastern Front, taking the pressure off of the Red Army in a way that would strengthen the West's position with the Soviets for post-war negotiation. I mean, look, the Allies could say to the Soviets after the war, we helped you out. We took surrenders of all these armies that you were going to have to fight. So to the Germans, this is a gift. And why in the world would Montgomery say no to it? So hold that question. Here's the thing about Montgomery that I think probably gets understated, particularly if you know about Montgomery from watching the famous 1970 movie Patton with George C. Scott playing George Patton. People remember him as vain and prickly and hard to work with, and that's all true. But on the Temelloberg, here at the beginning of May 1945, he gives one of the best performances of negotiation discipline that you will ever see. And every move he made was deliberate. Let's first start with this business about keeping the German officers waiting in the rain. So why did he do that? He wanted to make clear before a single word was spoken that this is not a meeting between equals. He's running the show. They have to come to him. And the British flag is flying over their heads. There's no German flag. I mean, he could have come out immediately and greeted them, but no, he's going to make them wait. And by the way, this is something that Vladimir Putin always does. He always makes people wait hours to meet with him if he can. He sees it as framing. And Montgomery saw it as framing here. This is a power play. But I want to be precise. Power plays in negotiation aren't always about ego. Sometimes they are about setting the bargaining range. And so if you sit down at a table as peers, which is normally what we do in a business negotiation, right? The deal is normally going to land somewhere in the middle. But if you refuse to sit down at the table as peers, if you make it clear that you're the one controlling this, then you have complete control over the deal, right? So Montgomery, before anyone had even said hello, framed the situation. Now, why did he insult them by refusing to acknowledge their identity? He goes to them and says, I've never heard of you. Never heard of you either. It reminded me of that Monty Python skit. Who are the Britons? There's an explanation of who the Britons are, and I think it's Michael Palin says, never heard of them. Well, that's what Bernard Montgomery's doing here. I never heard of you guys. But listen, he knew exactly who these people were. Bernard Montgomery was extremely smart. The Allies had excellent intelligence. He knew who von Friedeberg was. He'd been briefed. This is all theater. But it does something specific here. It says, your titles, your ranks, your government, none of that is real to me. Dönitz isn't even a head of state as far as I'm concerned. You are people who are standing on my hill, and you want something from me. So think about this to a normal negotiation opener. Normally you walk up and say, pleased to meet you. Please come in. You want something to drink? You try to build a bridge. And that's what I normally teach here. Try to build a bridge. And that opener works because it builds rapport and it lowers the temperature and it makes a deal more likely. But Montgomery in this situation doesn't want a deal to be more likely. In fact, at one point, the Germans talked to him about how they want to ask for mercy from the British. And Montgomery says something like, you should have thought about that 6 years ago at Coventry, referring to a bombing raid by the Germans that had destroyed the town of Coventry. So Montgomery is making clear that he wants exactly one deal on exactly his terms. And everything he does here is positioned to push the Germans toward that deal. One of the things he does here, and I alluded to this, is he absolutely refuses to negotiate inside the Germans' frame, right? Von Friedeberg makes a pitch. He talks about the army group Vistula. He talks about the 3 armies he has to surrender and withdrawing them from the face of the Russians. He offers them up on a silver platter to Montgomery, but Montgomery doesn't argue with the offer. And one thing he doesn't do is make a counterproposal, because once you make a counterproposal, you're involved in a negotiation, right? Montgomery doesn't want to even give them an inch to make them think they're in a negotiation. And normally you would not do this in a business scenario unless you had an extreme situation, as I said at the beginning, bad faith, stepping over the ethical line, things that your opponent did to the point where you don't want to engage in a back and forth with them. But here he's dealing with one of the most vicious and immoral governments in the history of mankind. And he's not going to give them any quarter at all. So he makes no counterproposal. He doesn't say, no, we're not going to allow you to surrender those 3 armies who are facing the Soviets. We're not going to allow you to surrender them to me. But how about this? Let me make a counteroffer. He doesn't do that. In fact, all he does is he ignores what von Friedeberg and the Germans have said completely. What he says is, basically, here's the deal. I will accept the unconditional surrender of all German forces in the Netherlands, in Northwest Germany, and in Denmark. That's it. As far as my accepting surrender of units that you have that are facing the Russians, that's off the table. So let's think about this for a second. In any negotiation, if the other side's opening frame is a problem, you have 2 choices, right? You can negotiate inside their frame, but as I said, the moment you do that, you've conceded that their frame is the relevant frame. And now you're haggling about terms that they've proposed. You know, I remember once I was involved in a difficult negotiation. And I mentioned it to my boss at the time. I said they had taken this position and I was trying to argue them out of this position. And he said, don't do that. The way to do that is just to reframe the issue to your benefit and answer the question that you asked yourself. What do I mean by that? Let's say your opponent comes in and lays out proposal A. You then reframe it by saying, if I understand it correctly, what you're really saying is proposal B, and you start negotiating on proposal B, completely ignoring proposal A. It's a little bit of a bold move, but it does work from time to time, and that's what Montgomery is doing right here. He's refusing the frame entirely and substituting his own. And he does it without explaining himself, without even acknowledging their original offer, without giving von Friedeberg anything to argue back against. He makes no counterproposal because he will not concede there was a proposal in the first place, right? And as I said, you can use this move. When somebody let's say you're negotiating a contract with a buyer and the buyer says, let's talk about price. And you know the conversation needs to be about scope. So you don't argue about price. You don't say price isn't the issue. You just start talking about scope, your own proposal, and you keep talking about scope. And if they try to grab you and pull you back into a discussion about price, you keep talking about scope. The frame belongs to whoever refuses to leave their own frame. Let me say that again. The framing of a negotiation belongs to whoever refuses to leave their own frame. And that is what Montgomery is doing here. Now, what happens next? Once Montgomery lays out the terms, he adds the following sentence. He says, if you don't agree to what I'm proposing here, all of your soldiers and civilians may be killed. And that's all he says. One sentence. He doesn't elaborate. He doesn't go any further into it. He doesn't repeat it. He just moves on. But that sentence is enormously important because it paints in the Germans' heads a picture of what is going to happen to their world if they leave this table without a deal. We often talk about BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Your leverage in any negotiation doesn't come from how much you want to make a deal. Your leverage comes from how unbearable the alternative will be to the other side. I had a negotiation teacher once who told me negotiation is simply the process of imposing costs on the other side. And even in a cooperative negotiation, that is true. So your BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, shouldn't really be a number, and it's not really a logical argument. It's a picture. You're creating a picture for the other side of what happens if they don't do this deal. And Montgomery here, in 7 words, handed the Nazis a picture so awful that the rest of the negotiation had to happen in its shadows. The next thing Montgomery did was create leverage and more leverage through the use of more pictures. So one of his aides was a guy named Trumbull Warren, and Warren later described how Montgomery prepared for the afternoon session of this discussion. He told his staff to put 2 maps on the table in the middle of the negotiating room showing overwhelming Allied strength surrounding the Nazi armies. And Warren himself admitted years later that the maps were exaggerated. They overstated how many troops the British had on the ground, but it didn't matter. Leverage in a negotiation doesn't have to be real, it just has to be believed. Now, I want to say, be careful about bluffing in a negotiation, because if you get called on the bluff and you're not prepared to back it up, you can destroy your credibility. But here, in this situation, the Germans looked at the maps, they had no reason not to believe the maps, and the story worked. The next thing Montgomery does in this negotiation is something you should always do in a negotiation. He controlled the clock. So after this first discussion about this surrender, von Friedeberg said he didn't have authority to agree to the absolute unconditional surrender proposed by Montgomery, and that he needed to go back and talk to Karl Dönitz, the ostensible leader of Germany at this point. He asked for 48 hours, and Montgomery said no. Montgomery said, you have 24 hours. Now, when you study this situation, that is an easy point to miss, but it is so important. Remember this, the calendar is a concession. Every additional hour you give the other side is an hour they can use to talk themselves out of doing the deal, right? Time is leverage. Never, never give away time when you don't have to. Next, we saw how Montgomery opened the negotiation with pressure, making the Germans stand on a line, making them wait in the rain, then saying he didn't even know who they were, then refusing to negotiate. But you still have to create pressure for closing, and he does. So von Friedeberg goes to meet with Dönitz, comes back the next day with authority from Dönitz. And Montgomery talks to them. And at this point, as he's starting to talk to the Nazi officers on day 2, a flight of Allied fighter bombers came in low and fast over the hilltop where they were meeting. It was loud enough to make the trucks rattle, loud enough that the conversation they were having had to stop. Now, the flyover may have been coincidence, or it may have been arranged. It's never been confirmed by anyone who was there on the British side. But whether it was coincidence or it was arranged is beside the point. The point is that opening pressure and closing pressure are different jobs, and you need both. You spend the opening pressure to get the other side to the table on your terms, and you spend closing pressure to get the pen into their hand moving on the paper. So you have to focus on both aspects of this. Later that afternoon, in a small carpeted tent on this hilltop, Montgomery sat at the head of a table with 2 BBC microphones in front of him, and he called each German officer in turn to come up and sign the absolute surrender document. And as a result of that document being signed, more than 1 million German soldiers laid down their weapons. So I want to pause here because I want to ask a hard question. Was Montgomery right to do what he did? Because, listen, it's true that there were a lot of German soldiers and civilians on the Eastern Front, and we know what was going to happen to them. And a lot of them were 18 and 19-year-old conscripts. They weren't hardcore Nazis. So when Montgomery said no to von Friedeberg's offer to accept the surrender, that Montgomery accept the surrender of these troops facing the Russians, Montgomery knew that a lot of these people on the Eastern Front were going to end up in captivity, and a lot of them were going to die there. And he knew that the people who were facing him, these German officers who were facing him, were in part trying to save those lives. So if you can save lives by saying yes, well, why say no? And there are a few reasons why Montgomery had to say no. And the first one is the deal in front of you is not always the deal you're protecting. So we're dealing with one negotiation here, right? We have the Germans proposing these terms of surrender. But Montgomery is thinking about, well, what about the next deal, right? There are implications to whatever I do here. And the minute I accept a partial surrender of forces fighting the Soviets, then he's going to validate the well-known Russian paranoia about the West. He would be telling Stalin, we are willing to make side deals with the Germans behind your back. And he would be affirming to the Germans that this wedge strategy, driving a wedge between the Soviets and the Western Allies, works. And that would become a weapon for Stalin. So he's very aware of that, Montgomery is, and he's refusing to play that game. The second thing is there's precedent here because in 1943 at the Casablanca Conference, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and Winston Churchill agreed publicly that the only way the war was going to end was with unconditional surrender. No negotiations, no partial surrenders, unconditional surrender. And this wasn't just rhetoric, it was the entire architecture of how the war was supposed to end and how the peace was going to be organized. So the moment that Montgomery would agree to negotiate with the Germans, every German commander in every theater would know the unconditional surrender theory is nonsense. These guys are willing to negotiate terms with us. And so all these other German officers who were running theaters of this war would start separately negotiating for their own deals. So Montgomery holding the line here meant that the next 20 negotiations wouldn't happen. And that's something to keep in mind in business, man. Once you take a stand and move off that stand, the other side's going to see, oh, well, when they said that that was as far as they were willing to go, that was a lie. We can negotiate with them. They have no credibility, right? So holding the line was important for that reason. And the next reason I think that you need to look at is you have to hand the next negotiator who's going to be advancing your position the strongest position you can hand them. Montgomery knew that he wasn't going to be the last person to take a German surrender in this war. And in fact, 3 days later at a schoolhouse in Reims, France, the American negotiators were going to sit down against a different group of Nazi negotiators. And after that, the Soviets were going to have to sit down with the Germans in Berlin. Every one of those negotiators was going to inherit the position that Montgomery created here. So it's one thing to say that Montgomery held the line, but it's another thing entirely to watch what happens when the same Germans with the same strategy try the same play on a different group of negotiators later. And that's what happens at Reims a few days later. On May 5th, von Friedeberg, the same guy who met with Montgomery, now goes to General Eisenhower's headquarters at Reims. And he meets with American officials there. Dönitz has sent von Friedeberg with the same idea he had in the first meeting with Montgomery. He proposes a general surrender, but only on the Western Front. The Germans who are facing the Russians would keep fighting. So this is a wedge strategy again. Now, Eisenhower has been briefed on the Montgomery negotiation, and he knows Montgomery has held the line. And Eisenhower decides he's going to stand back from the negotiation entirely. He doesn't even attend the talks. He delegates the whole thing to his chief of staff, Walter Beadle Smith, a man who was known as, well, one person who worked for him called him a number one square-wheeled SOB. So Beadle Smith sits down with von Friedeberg, and von Friedeberg makes the pitch. And it's the same pitch he meant to Montgomery, a Western surrender with the East left open. And Beadle Smith, following Eisenhower's instruction, holds the line. Unconditional surrender, all fronts, all forces, not negotiable. And von Friedeberg says he doesn't have authority for that. He has to go talk to Dönitz. And Dönitz, playing for time, says, listen, I'll send somebody more senior down there. Just stall. So May 6, 1945, a German army car pulls up at this schoolhouse in Reims where Eisenhower's headquarters is, and General Alfred Jodl gets out. Jodl is the chief of the operations staff of the entire German army, and he outranks von Friedeberg, and he was a close confidant of Hitler for years. And he's come here to do what, in his mind, what Montgomery refused to let von Friedeberg do, which is have this surrender and leave the Soviets out of it. Jodl walks into the war room. He makes the pitch. We'll surrender in the West, but the East is a separate matter. And Beadle Smith says no. So Jodl tries again. And now he emphasizes the humanitarian part of this with the refugees and the soldiers, and they're all going to get killed in the Soviet Union. And it's a real concern, but Beadle Smith holds the line again. So Jodl at this point asks for time, right? He says he has to go talk to Dönitz again. And here's where the connection to the Montgomery negotiation becomes really tight. Eisenhower, who's one floor up from this negotiation in the building, does exactly what Montgomery did. He controls the clock. He sends word down to the American negotiators, tell Jodl he has until 2:30 a.m., and that's it. And tell him that if he hasn't signed by then, I'm going to close the Western Front. I'm going to seal the lines, and not one more German will be allowed to come west. Every German soldier currently trying to run to the British and American lines will be turned back into Soviet hands. This is the same powerful move that Montgomery made when he said all your soldiers and civilians may be killed. Montgomery painted that picture, and Eisenhower paints the same picture. So Jodl now radios to Dönitz, and Dönitz says, let's sign the thing. It's the best we can do. And that's it. The Americans sign a surrender agreement with the Germans. There's a Soviet general who attends and signs as a witness for Stalin, and a French general signs as a witness for de Gaulle. Now, there's a small detail here. After he signs, Jodl, this German general, stands up and asks if he can say a few words. And there's media in the room. There's reporters in the room. And he says, with this signature, the German people and the German armed forces are, for better or worse, delivered into the victor's hands. And I express hope that the victor will treat them with generosity. Now, that's kind of a crazy thing to say for a Nazi general, considering the way they had treated people in Europe for the past 6 years. But he does say it. And it sounds like a guy who came to negotiate, and he discovered in the middle of the meeting that there wasn't going to be a negotiation. So it's kind of the sound that the Allies wanted to hear, because it's the sound of a wedge strategy that failed. And by the way, the Rem surrender had a second act. Stalin read the news about this, and he decided there weren't enough Soviets at the Rem's signing, so he demanded a do-over in Berlin. And on May 8th, the Germans had to go to Berlin and sign a formal agreement with the Red Army. And von Friedeberg was there for that signature too. So crazy. So I want to talk about the takeaways from this. I think they're important. So let's talk about 3 of them in particular. First of all, negotiation is largely a fight over positioning, like chess, right? So when the other side's opening frame is a problem, don't argue inside the frame. Destroy the frame, right? Von Friedeberg came to negotiate which forces were going to surrender to which armies, the Soviets or the West. And Montgomery completely refused to engage on that question. He just substituted his own question and never acknowledged the Germans' question. So remember this about negotiation. If a conversation is happening within the other side's frame, you've already lost the negotiation. The first fight in a negotiation has to be over how the negotiation is going to be framed. Second, you got to manufacture leverage wherever you can. And when you do, you have to make the picture you're giving to the other side vivid. So the exaggerated maps that Montgomery showed the Nazis, the flyover by the fighter bombers, the sentence that all your soldiers and civilians are going to be killed if you don't sign this. None of these were negotiations about anything. These are images planted in the other side's head. Remember, BATNA is not a spreadsheet. The best BATNA that you can present the other side is a picture. Make clear to the other side what's going to happen if the deal doesn't get signed. Third, be careful about power plays in negotiation, particularly if you're dealing with someone that you like and respect and you want to deal with in the future. But don't take power plays out of your arsenal for appropriate times. So what did Montgomery do here? He kept the German negotiators waiting in the rain. He asked who they were. He showed them contempt. You know, every one of those things that he did had an effect on the Germans, right? Remember, if you sit down as peers at a negotiating table, you are going to negotiate as peers. And most of the time, that's what you want to do. But there are going to be some times that you can't sit down as peers, and you have to be clear on what those times are, and you have to be firm about your position. So those are some takeaways from this negotiation. This book is wonderful, Victory 45 by James Holland and Al Murray. I strongly suggest that you put it in your negotiation library. You won't be disappointed. I think if you know World War II history, a lot of the stories in the book are going to be familiar to you, but there's new information included here. And he does go through negotiations not only with the Germans, but also with the Japanese. I think it's fascinating. So let's bring it home. On May 4th, 1945, on a wet hilltop, which is south of Hamburg, Germany, a small man in a black beret and white corduroys looked at 5 German officers and asked, "Who are these men?" And he knew exactly who they were when he asked the question. He just didn't intend to negotiate with them at all. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do at a negotiating table is to refuse to admit there's a negotiation even happening. And folks, that's all I have for you today on the Station for Negotiation. So this is Gene Killian signing off and reminding you once again that negotiation is life. Hey, thanks for listening to the Station for Negotiation podcast. Until next time, you can keep up with us on social media at the following places. On X, formerly known as Twitter, it's at STN4Negotiation. That's at STN4Negotiation. On Facebook, you can hit us up at facebook.com/station4negotiation pod. That's facebook.com/station4negotiation pod. Over on Instagram, you can reach us at station4negotiation. Again, that's at station4negotiation. On LinkedIn, station4negotiation podcast. Again, that's station4negotiation podcast. Over on YouTube, we're at station4negotiation. That's at station4negotiation. If you want to shoot us an email, you can do that at station4negotiationpod@gmail.com. That's station4negotiationpod@gmail.com. So we'll see you next time on the Station for Negotiation podcast. And until then, remember, negotiation is life.
The grill is shot. The chairs are held together by optimism. And what happened to the rug? Sounds like your outdoor setup is not ready for patio season. Fix it all with Wayfair. Shop Wayfair for grills, rugs, furniture, and more. With 20 million 5-star reviews, room of choice delivery, and expert setup on qualifying orders, it's never been easier to do more for less. Get 10% off your first eligible purchase. Hurry to wayfair.com or download the app now.
Wayfair, every style, every home.